Hi, everybody. I apologize for the late start, but I'm Aria Rowan, the director of the Science Squad Corporation. And today we're going to be hosting Mrs. Kelley Templin, and she's going to be talking a little bit about the scientific method. And so I'm just going to hand that right off to her.
Good evening, Aria. And thank you for inviting me to join in participating in the Science Squad lecture series. It's an honor and a privilege to be involved within this endeavor of yours. So I wanted to just start out talking about, I'm an environmental health and safety professional with Cargill up in Hersey, Michigan. We're a solution mine. And my background is in chemistry. So some of you might think, what is the connection between chemistry and environmental health and safety, and how do you get there? So as most people who might study the sciences started out as a young age with a curiosity, wanting to learn new things and just discover and that on my own. Continued to study science and math all through school, and then in high school my chemistry teacher, Mr. Gormley, really inspired me to study chemistry as a discipline. So I started out on that in Denver, and through different paths, and that ultimately ended up with an opportunity to study industrial chemical technology with Ferris State University. Ultimately ended up working with the solution mine in the quality assurance lab. So as you can imagine, my chemistry studies with that allowed me to work in the lab, perform the experiments, and test and do the analysis for the salt. My chemistry background also helped me to understand the process of how you solution mine to bring brine up from deep in the earth, recrystallize that, and put it in the form of a water softener salt you may use in your home or in the foods that you may purchase at our local stores. So, that's basic chemistry, and that makes sense. So how do you go from chemistry to environmental health and safety? I think people can make a connection between chemistry and science with the environmental portion of my role. Environmental science is a great discipline, and many people go down that path. But for me, with my chemistry and science background, what that does in the environmental portion might mean water sampling, running tests on the water samples that we have, maybe running tests on some soil samples, determining chlorides in those samples. It might be air monitoring. What is the particulate that we have? So in that regard, determining what test methods are appropriate. Science and chemistry is a great background for that. Determining the test methods, how do you take those samples? What is the protocol? Can the labs in the area actually run those lab samples and give you those results that you are anticipating? In many cases, before I send samples to the lab, I might look for a field test to give me an idea if I'm within range, an idea of what results I should receive from the certified lab. What test methods are out there that I can use in the field? And once I bring those test strips in, how do I use them? How to collect the samples? What's the protocol for running the test? And do those results actually meet the parameters I'm looking for? Sending that information and the samples into the lab. We receive those reports back. The other part of my role is reading those reports, interpreting that data. Are we within our parameters? If not, what else do we have to do to meet those parameters? And then communicate that information out. This communication is to a varied audience. So I might be speaking with business leaders with accounting degrees. I might be speaking with chemical engineers, welders, millwrights, packaging technicians. So how can I interpret that data and communicate that to these people so they have an understanding based on their background? because everyone needs that information and they're entitled to that, and they really do seek that information and want that. So that's a lot of the environmental side and how I use science in that regard and my chemistry background. So how do you connect the chemistry and the science with the health and safety portion of it? Safety data sheets. Like any other industry, we use chemicals and compounds in our process. We need to understand what in those compounds. What's the chemical composition? What are the hazards associated with it? Could I harm the environment? What happens if it potentially makes it to a waterway? What happens if I splash some on my skin? How do I protect myself in that regard? I use the safety data sheet for that compound or chemical to help me determine that. It's a wealth of information right there in those 16 sections of the data sheet. So again, I have to take that chemical scientific language and communicate that in a way that the packaging technicians, the welders, those people can understand and use that product safely. Are there engineering controls we put into place for that? Maybe there's personal protective equipment they need to understand. In some cases, we might review the product and realize there's too many hazards and we really don't want to accept the risk. So question, is there a safer chemical out there? A chemical or compound that doesn't have all of the hazards associated with it? Curiosity, right? Start with a question, do your research, what's out there? Have other cargo sites used a different product? Is there another product that other industries similar to our process used and had great outcomes with it where they don't have the hazards? So that's all part of that process and the problem solving that goes on. So the safety data sheets, clear example of how I use chemistry and my science background for the health and safety part. Industrial hygiene is another area. Do we have noise exposure? How much noise exposure? What can we do to reduce the noise exposure? Do we have particulates? Is there dust? What type of dust? How much dust? Vapors, fumes, anything of that nature that we might have with our process, we need to understand what our exposure limits are. I don't necessarily perform the industrial hygiene test, but I work with the people that are trained to do that. They'll come in and we make the monitoring, we area monitor, personnel monitoring. My role in that is, again, receiving that information, all of the data in the nice tables, all of the recommendations, interpreting that, what's the exposure for an 8, 10, 12-hour shift? Is there an exposure where we have to put controls in place? Or are we okay? Noise exposure, is there a better drill out there that has a lower decibel rating? So going back to that questioning, curiosity, research, yes, we think there is this drill that has the lower decibel rating. Let's try that. So in essence, we're performing an experiment. Does that drill actually work as well as the drill we're trying to replace, the louder drill? So using that thought process that I've developed along the way. Dust, how do we protect people from dust if we do in fact have dust? What type of dust is it? Ultimately, questioning how do we eliminate the dust? That's where I come in, asking those questions. What is available to us out in the industry that we can use an engineering control so that people don't have to go around wearing respirators? Much better for the employee in so many regards. And then ultimately too, we're not putting that dust into the environment. One thing Cargill is very good stewards of the environment. And we want to keep our communities, air, water, employees all safe in that regard. So you might be thinking, and as Aria mentioned in the beginning, that this sounds a lot like the scientific method. And you'd be spot on if you are thinking that way. It is a problem-solving method, the skill set I developed going through my chemistry studies, asking the question, developing a hypothesis. Now I have this hypothesis. How do I prove it or disprove it? Coming up with an experiment. In many cases, for me, that's not a lab experiment, but maybe it's a procedure to try. Gathering a group of people, reviewing that experiment or procedure, and then testing it. Ultimately, once we do that, what does that data tell us? Did we prove our hypothesis? Great. Let's write that conclusion. This is a process or a new procedure we want to use. It will work. We've done the experiment. We have the data to prove it. So this is something we're going to implement. If we didn't prove the hypothesis, then do we need to perform a different experiment? Maybe some minor adjustments need to be made. So talking that all through, making those adjustments, and again, going through proving or disproving that hypothesis. Once again, once we go through that, large portion is communication. Taking that information and putting it into a format that people can understand and use in the daily production that we have. So, so environmental health and safety data sheets, sampling, really relatable back to science. Maybe it's a new process. Maybe we have to change the way we package salt, or maybe we're looking at a new scrubber system because we have a new compliance regulatory program that has either been revised or it's a new parameter that we have to meet from the EPA or the DEQ. Sometimes OSHA or MyOSHA will come out with compliance revisions. And again, with Cargill, we are going to be in compliance, and in many cases we'll go above and beyond compliance in that regard. So new process, new scrubber system. We have to think that through. What is the effect on the environment? Will we maintain our compliance? What is the effect of the employees in the plant? How does it affect the community? Will it introduce noise to the community? Again, we want to make sure that we're being good stewards across the board. So, scientific method, you ask that question. How is this going to affect us? Developing the hypothesis. We think by changing the scrubber system, there won't be any additional dust. So can we develop a model? Maybe we don't want to install the scrubber system and test it at that point. So we can develop a model that we can use on the computer and get data that way. Maybe it's a new piece of equipment, a new packaging piece of equipment that will ultimately make it safer to put salt in a bag. That's our hypothesis. We think this equipment will be safer for our employees to use. Develop a procedure to test that. If the people who use that equipment involved with developing that procedure and testing that procedure. Once we test the procedure, is in fact that piece of equipment safer for the employee to use? If it is, great. We have our conclusion, we proved our hypothesis, and we go on and communicate the new procedure. Maybe we don't necessarily prove that. Maybe with some adjustments to the procedures or maybe some adjustments to the equipment, we can make it a safer process. And that's where our procedure, going through that, we decided we needed to adjust the hypothesis, redo the procedure, and ultimately we come to the conclusion that we have made it a safer system. Communication. People have to know that. So a big part of my role in environmental health and safety, if you haven't realized through this presentation, is problem solving, asking the question, researching, has the method been tested before? What were the outcomes? If not, maybe we have to develop a testing procedure. Go through that process. Did we prove it? Did we disprove our hypothesis? Drawing those conclusions. And then far most important is the communication piece, because people need to know and they need to understand, in my world, what the ramifications are for any of the changes, new chemicals, testing, whatever may come across that could affect the environment and employees' health, safety, or the health and safety of the community, because that's what we ultimately like to do with Cargill. So problem solving, again, I developed that skill set through studying chemistry and the scientific method, put it to use almost every day. There is the connection between chemistry and environmental health and safety. I've enjoyed taking the road. I did start out, as I mentioned, in high school with the idea that I was going to study chemistry, ultimately become a member of the American Chemical Society. Took several different paths, took a little bit longer to get there, but ultimately I did accomplish my goal. I did study chemistry. I have the chemical background, and I do, in fact, belong to the American Chemical Society and read my C&E journal. So problem solving, communication are key things to take away when you're studying the sciences. And don't give up on your goals. You'll eventually reach them. Might not necessarily take the path, but you can achieve them. So with that, that really concludes my presentation. I appreciate the opportunity, Aria.
All right, thank you so much. That was a really entertaining lecture. And I will see you all next week, hopefully, where we will present another lecture in our lecture series. And have a good night.